Hi, everyone. Welcome to another session, American Public Policy Redux. Today's Thursday, March 11th. I think this is number 19, Pat, or something like that. I think I saw last week was 18. This is number 19. We're getting up there.
Well, we have a couple that didn't get recorded, so
True.
so we're over 20.
I'm excited. Tonight we're going to be talking about presidential transitions, specifically Trump to Biden. With our lovely favorite friend, Jen Odell, St. Mary's alum. But first, she would like to know, everyone to know that if you have any questions, feel free to jump in at any time. Don't hesitate, like all of, most of our discussions. Remember that we're being recorded. So if you do jump in, you will get recorded. We're on active speaker mode. If you do not wish to be recorded, keep yourself on mute. Send over a chat and I can read the question or comment for you. Or we can just talk about other things on the chat sometimes. But before we get started, Pat, you said you had a few announcements you wanted to pass along to us.
Yeah, I'll be quick about it. And because I'm old and senile, I may have posted some of the stuff beforehand, but I've got some more details. So I'm looking at upcoming sessions. And increasingly, I'm finding it, I think it'll be great to involve other folks. You've got to be bored with me by now. So one of them, and these are connected to topics in the survey that Michelle sent out to everyone in December. So it's not making up new stuff. It's things that you folks have already indicated an interest in. One has to do with districting, gerrymandering, redistricting, and also, and this was really the connection, but and it has to do with the two-party system and the possibility for third parties. Well, Ranjan Rohatgi, who's a relatively new guy in the math department, he and I taught a math of voting class, just a one credit fun thing a few years ago, and he's continuing to do it as a one credit course. In addition, I I encouraged him, and he ended up on Indiana's redistricting commission. So he'll have really cool insights, and he'll make available a bunch of resources. So that's one of them, is Ranjan and I to do something on that in that area. Another one, folks, it's cropped up a couple of times about the technology, changing technology of polling. And I've been in contact with Meg Goldberg, whom you've already met, and she's pretty excited about doing that. And that works out nicely because I can talk about the way that polls were done in the past, because that's my experience. And then she can update that and then talk about sort of the limits, issues and limits of new kind of polling. The last one, I saw Leslie there. Is Anne around?
She's there.
She's there. Okay. I've contacted them. This is where I put you all on the spot. About them just doing a session on another one of the topics, which was the role of agencies, either on the state level with Leslie, the Department of Audits, or on the national level, offices of inspectors general, which is where Anne has her experience. If the two of them can do that. And I thought that those would be three really fun sessions that would also give everybody a kind of variety in terms of who's doing the presentation and how they're doing it. We don't have dates nailed down yet, but that's just to let you know it's coming. Cool? All right, without further ado, my best student ever.
You're doing it just as we rehearsed. Go on.
Oh, I'm not supposed to laugh.
Work. Yeah.
Jennifer Odell, who is involved in the presidential transition, or as my daughter pointed out, non-transition between Trump and Biden. And this is really cool, interesting, important stuff. So I think we're really, this is great that Jennifer is going to be able to do this. So Jennifer, let her rip.
Okay, I'll let her rip. All right, so I'm going to divide this up into a couple parts. I'm going to talk first about why my employer, the laborers union, gave a crap about the presidential transition. To just give a little context as to why they wanted to involve me in the agency review teams for the transition. And then we're going to talk about how a transition is supposed to work according to the law and according to modern presidential history, how it's worked. And then we're going to talk about how it worked this time, which I think the last part is probably the most interesting. So and the part where I was more involved, obviously. So hopefully we can have some discussion at the end about that. And you guys can ask me some questions and I can try to find the answer. So so I was a volunteer for the agency review transition team. And I want to stress that I wasn't a named member of the team. I was a volunteer. I was asked to volunteer from my union and from the members of the transition team itself. And I should also say that these are my views, not the views of the laborers union. I was on the Federal Reserve Banking and Security Regulators team. So I know that's a lot of words. So what did that do in practice? It was supposed to oversee a few agencies, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, and the National Credit Union Administration. And then finally, my favorite of all of the agencies, the Securities and Exchange Commission. Yes, I have a favorite agency, don't you? So why would the laborers union be interested in this group of agencies? Well, the laborers union, we represent about 500,000 construction workers across the US and Canada. Construction workers, I mean the guys who do the heavy lifting at a job site. These guys have pension plans, defined benefit pension plans, and we have over 100 of them across the US and Canada. And collectively, those benefit funds have about $50 billion in assets, billion with a B. So what my job is at the laborers is I serve as the union's responsible investment advisor. So I help those pension fund trustees, because each one of these pension funds are duly trusteed, meaning they're half management, half laborers, half union members. I help the union members figure out ways to invest that money in a way that's also going to not only make money, but it's also going to put our members to work. So, investing in things like union real estate, investing in things like good infrastructure projects, things that we're going to get a double bottom line. So you can see why we'd be interested in the financial markets, in particular with that $50 billion in assets. Back in during the financial crisis of 2006, 7, and 8, our funds were really harmed. We were, in some cases, they were decimated. They went from, being fully funded and having these long-term growth horizons of like 60 plus years to having hardly any money in them because we lost a lot of that money in the financial crisis. So right after the financial crisis was over, Dodd-Frank Act, which I know we've talked about a little bit, I've talked about a little bit on these calls, was passed to help reform some of the laws that had been passed that allowed banks to basically erode pension plans and American savings accounts the way that they did. Two laws basically deregulated the financial system. And so I would say they allowed banks to invest in housing related derivatives. I'm sure you guys heard a lot about that during the housing crisis about derivatives. It's just a fancy way to say they took a bad bet, quite honestly. They're really complicated. And that was another part of the problem is nobody really understood them. They were so profitable that they encouraged banks to keep on lending to even riskier borrowers, to be honest with you. And the instability of that led to the financial crisis. So then the Financial Services Modernization Act of 1999 allowed banks to use deposits to invest in these derivatives. And bank lobbyists said they needed this change to compete with foreign banks. they promised to only invest in low risk securities to protect their customers. But here's the surprise ending of that story. That's not what they did. Not at all. So the Commodity Futures Modernization Act exempted derivatives from regulatory oversight altogether. It also overruled any state regulations, and big banks had the resources to manage these complicated derivatives. So they said, we should be able to do it because we have the smartest guys in the room. So we're going to make y'all money, just hold tight. So hedge funds and other financial institutions own these things called mortgage-backed securities. But they were also in mutual funds, corporate assets, and in our pension funds. So pension funds like ours bought these risky assets because they thought that they were insured, because that's what we were told, that they were insured by, actually AIG, the big company, they insured them and they sold these things as swaps. And when the derivatives lost value, they didn't have enough money to back it up. If you remember all this. So in 2007, all the banks began to panic because they didn't have enough money to pay back all the losses, and they stopped lending to each other. And they didn't want other banks to have to give them worthless mortgages of collateral. And as a result, interbank lending stopped. That's called LIBOR, and they stopped lending to one another. The Federal Reserve started pumping liquidity into the banking system. And these mortgage-backed securities had a huge impact, obviously, on the housing market. So here, the profitability of these mortgage-backed securities created way more demand for the mortgages than they were actually based on. So here comes the financial crisis of 2008, began in that March of 2008, and the investors sold off all their shares of investment bank Bear Stearns because they had too much of these derivatives and these other toxic assets. And then Bear approached JP Morgan Chase to help bail it out, but the Fed had to sweeten the deal, and they gave them a $30 billion guarantee. I know this is ancient history, but I think it just gives a little bit of context to the rest of this and why I give a crap about the Securities and Exchange Commission. So the situation on Wall Street deteriorated throughout the summer of 2008. So then Congress told the Treasury Secretary to take over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, if you remember all of that. And it cost $187 billion at the time to do that to the federal government. And then in September, the Fed loaned another $100 billion to AIG to bail that out. And then in October, November, the Fed and Treasury had to bail out again all of the banks, and that was another $182 billion. So then the Treasury Secretary and the Fed chair submitted a $700 billion bailout package to Congress. It had to help stop the run, but then the Republicans blocked the bill for a couple weeks because they didn't want to bail out the banks, and then they finally approved it in October. So all of this is happening, over the beginning of the year, all the way until October. So then, banks are bailed out. There's a committee set up called the TARP committee to help figure out how they're going to bail out the banks. Tons of money. The Obama administration gets this in their first term. They have to deal with, all of the banks failing. Several banks failed, if you remember correctly. And then they created the Dodd-Frank Act to help try to prevent this stuff in the future. So since then, in 2016, they've been that law has been eroded every year since its passage until right now at this moment. In fact, the year after Dodd-Frank was passed, how it worked was they had all this enacting legislation given out to all the agencies, and then they had to write rules and regulations based on the law they were given. So since then, Wall Street has been trying to erode that since Jump Street. So a lot of Dodd-Frank never actually, while it was passed, never was enacted. If you want a really fun telling of this whole bailing out Wall Street, and you should read The Big Short by Michael Lewis or see the movie, or he's the same guy who wrote Moneyball. I know all this sounds totally unsexy, but for some reason that movie really, I think it's a really good retelling of it. So now I'm going to move on to the actual logistics of the agency review teams and how they fit into the transition at large. I just wanted to give you that background to say all of that affected our pension plans deeply. So right after the financial crisis, I was asked by our union to become a registered lobbyist to help pass Dodd-Frank, and help the Securities and Exchange Commission to kind of work on those rules and regulations, put in our perspective as the labor movement and as laborers as to what would be the most beneficial to our pension funds who really suffered from the crisis. So that's why they got me engaged in it. And that's why I kind of became a subject matter expert for our union on anything that was banking regulations or security regulations. And it didn't hurt that the thing that they ask I do mostly at my job is I help I help our pension funds and our trustees directly engage corporations about, executive compensation practices. I help them engage about, some corporate practices that actually we think are risky and harm the bottom line. So I had been doing a lot of this work for a while, but then when Dodd-Frank got passed, we realized that we needed somebody to focus a little bit more full time on how that act could benefit our benefit funds. So generally, the timeline for a presidential transition works like this. So the General Services Administration, I don't know if anybody, do any of you guys work for, nobody works for the federal government, right? Nobody's a political appointee okay. The General Services Administration is in charge of the transition. They are the ones who are helping to organize the very large amount of people and the extreme amount of money it takes to go from a transition from one party to another, or transition if it's the same presidential from 4 years to his next 4 years. It takes a lot of coordination because you can imagine with all the agencies in the federal government, especially a transition that just happened now takes a lot of coordination because there are 2.1 million federal employees. And under the Trump administration, there were 22,000 empty positions. And that's not normal. Jobs just didn't get filled. So there were 22,000 jobs, and there are right now about that many that need to be filled by the Biden administration, jobs that exist. This is a combination of both career civil servant jobs, and it's also, that includes also the political appointment jobs. So 12 months before the election happens, the General Services Academy, or the GSA, produces a report that summarizes for both parties, both the Republican and the Democratic candidate. It summarizes for both of them all of the modern transition activities and resources that are available to them. So each party gets this book that's supposed to be nonpartisan. It's just a book that says, here's all the crap you got to do in order to have a successful transition. That's a whole year before the election even happens. So 1 year, November before. 6 months before the actual election, the current president, establishes a White House Transition Coordinating Council. At least that's what he's supposed to do. The last guy didn't do that. Even though this is in the law, mind you, there is an actual Federal Transitions Act that is supposed to be followed. The current president establishes this White House Transition Coordinating Council. Then each agency, all of the agencies from state all the way down to the FDIC, they nominate transition directors, individual people and a team of people at each one of the agencies that's in charge of the transition. So they begin to meet on a regular basis, and this is 6 months before. So they're meeting weekly at this point. Then each agency, as I said, designates one senior career employee to oversee all of these transition stuff that's happening, right? And then the Federal Transition Coordinator, he reports to the Senate in a specific committee. In fact, he reports to the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and the Governmental Affairs in the House Committee on Oversight and Reform. So they have one guy who's supposed to be overlooking all of this. He's in charge of all these agency directors that are all set up all around every one of the agencies in Washington, D.C. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Jen, I was gonna ask, so real quick, so the current president sets this up for either a potential new incoming president or himself, herself, like the current president?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
got it.
yeah, because it's traditional, even with an incumbent like a president who wins a second term, there's still going to be a lot of people that are going to leave each agency after the end of first term. There's a lot of turnover. So there's going to be new policies that they're going to want to fight for in a second term that they wouldn't have necessarily been focused on in a first term. So there's going to be new people, new expertise they're going to be looking for. So yeah, exactly. So the guy in charge, the current president, is the one who sets up the coordinating committee. And then the General Services Agency is overseeing all of it for the current president.
Do you know the rationale? I mean, the reporting to the House Governmental Affairs,
Mm-hmm.
that makes perfectly good sense.
Yeah, but why Homeland Security?
Yeah. Do
I
you
don't
know anything
know.
about it? Yeah.
I don't know. That's a really good question. I'm going to look that up and see why. I
Weird.
mean, that committee didn't even exist until,
Right.
9/11, after 9/11. So I'm not sure why it would be that committee. I mean,
Yeah,
I guess there is an argument to be made that it is about security and a peaceful transition of power. So
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
Yeah, usually you didn't have to worry so much about the security part.
You got that right, sir. So then the next step, post-convention, all the way through the election. So 3 months before the actual election, that federal transition coordinator reports to the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and the Governmental Affairs in the House on Oversight and Reform. And he tells them everything that they're working on. So he has to make a formal report 3 months before to say, this is where we're at. But then not later than September 1st, the GSA, the General Services Administration, gets memorandums of understanding with each eligible candidate regarding support services. So they want to make sure that they're going to be supported. If the Democrat wins, the Republican wins, and there's still, this is at the convention, so there's several candidates. We still don't know who's going to be the nominee. They're working with all of them to ensure that they're going to have the information that they need to have a successful transition, because it's obviously in everybody's best interest that the transition happens in the way that it always happens, and fluidly. So at this point, so then we're getting up closer to past the convention, getting closer to the election. All of the agencies then in the federal government, they have to give briefing materials to the actual two nominees. This is how the transition is going to work at our agency. Here's the team we have in place. Here's the policies that we're working on. Here's all the laws and rules that this is where we're at in notice. This is where we're at in comment on these pieces of legislation. So it's a big, huge amount of work that each agency does once every 4 years to put all this information together. So here's what's supposed to happen then the day after the election. So the GSA is supposed to provide office space and support services to the president-elect and the vice president-elect. And that support's supposed to continue for 60 days after the inauguration as well. They get their classified summaries regarding national security at that time. It's given as soon as possible after the election. They're supposed to have that briefing for security. And 30 days before the current president is supposed to leave his term, the GSA begins to support the outgoing president and vice president with support. And then they support them for 7 months after they leave office as well. So that's how it was supposed to work. And if you all remember, that's not exactly how it went down under the Trump administration. First, because if you remember, they refused, the woman from the General Services Administration refused to sign off on allowing that money to go. Now, I should also mention this, that the federal government gives money to the president-elect and the vice president-elect to hire staff, to provide moving expenses to people that need to get to Washington, D.C. And it's to the tune of about $9 million on average that the federal government gives to the new person. And then the new president, the president-elect, also is raising money privately during this time. I just read today that President Biden raised the most of any current incoming president ever. He raised over $22 million just for the transition. But generally, this is what screwed up the agency transition teams that I worked with, is that everybody was stopped. They weren't allowed to talk to anybody in the agencies. They weren't allowed to move into their offices at the GSA. They weren't allowed to start hiring staff. They weren't allowed to start offering contracts to people. They couldn't do any of that because they weren't released to do that from the GSA. And that was problematic, as you'll see a little bit later, because the work of the agency review teams is really to talk to those people inside the agencies, and that put a kibosh to all of that. We weren't allowed to talk to any of them. So
Jennifer, quick question for you. So you talked about step one. Was step one not done? And so this was kind of a rolling ball that just went, by the time you got to election day and the day after, there was no way to get it off the ground? Or were there some of those steps that were taken and they just stopped once Trump got nervous?
Well, first of all, Trump didn't have a transition team, period. End of story. He didn't have one. And that is really, really strange. Each party, each candidate always has a transition team. From what I asked this of a friend of mine who was one of the named members of the actual transition team, like, why do you think he didn't have a transition team? And everybody believes it just is because he didn't think he was going to win. And why go through all of that to actually have a formal transition team process? Now, I don't know if that's true, but they never started. What do you think, Dr. Pierce? You're making a face.
Dr. Pierce? Wow.
Oh, sorry. Professor Pierce.
I think he didn't care.
Yeah.
I mean, he was never really about governing anyway.
Yeah.
And so those are not things that he would value. I mean, who knows what goes on in his head in terms of expectations about whether he's going to win or lose, because all the blustering, was on top of whatever, if he was thinking, what he was thinking the outcome might be. But I think he just didn't care.
Could have been that maybe he himself believed that he transitioned well without a transition team when he threw the book out and threw everything out after Christie created whatever for like 8 or 9 months. And he was like, well, I could do it by myself. This is a waste of whatever. Like, do you think that maybe he justified it that way, that he could do it? It doesn't matter. He doesn't need it.
Well, but the only way that you could come to that conclusion is if you didn't care about what actually happened when you were governing. Because
I get your point.
Anybody paying attention would say you were a disaster. You didn't effectively govern at all. But again, I think it says that that's not really what he cared about. We've been talking about this in a bunch of these things, but the growing primacy of elections over policymaking, well, Trump fits into that beautifully. He never cared about policymaking. He loved all the hoopla around campaigning and rallies and stuff like that, but he didn't care about governing.
No, and I would say that, just to final answer your question, is that step one wasn't taken really and fully and totally. There weren't people that were designated as agency team leaders from senior staff. All of that, you'll see when I talk about this a little bit later on, what that actually did to what kind of information the Biden team had accessible, and how that kind of harms government, I think, at the end of the day. So the actual work of the agency review teams they're responsible for understanding the operations of every single agency in the federal government, and their job and the tasks they were given is to ensure a smooth transition of power and preparing President Biden and Vice President Harris elect and their cabinet to be able to hit the ground running on day one. Now, at this point, this is just how the Biden-Harris team operated. I can only speak to how how they did it. Although I am told from others when I asked around people in my union who have kind of gone through this several times, that the way that they operated was very similar to other presidents, including President Bush during his transition. This is kind of how it also operated. So this is all to say this isn't some crazy Democratic way to do it. This is what other modern presidents have also done. The teams, the actual agency review teams are made of really highly experienced professionals with deep backgrounds in policy related to each one of those agencies across the federal government. The teams themselves had been crafted to make sure that not only they reflected the priorities of the Biden-Harris administration, but also reflect the diversity of perspectives of other interested outside parties, other constituencies, other interest groups. So I think the Biden-Harris team and other modern presidents ran it this way too, knew that they had a platform. They wanted to make sure that the agencies were going to follow what their platform was, but they were smart enough to know that they might not know all of the things that they needed to know about each agency and what each constituency group really wanted to see change. Because I have to say that what was really striking in all the meetings that I met with other people to the agency review teams was that it was all about change. It was all about, we have been so screwed over the past 4 years. How are we going to make sure and to change what's happened and fix what's happened over the 4 years? That's a little different than in other transitions, I think, because there was a lot of midnight rulemaking, especially that happened during the Trump administration, meaning a lot of laws and regulation were passed in the last month of the Trump administration that were extremely problematic and aren't easy to reverse for a lot of reasons, mostly being the Congressional Review Act. It's really hard to reverse some of these regulations that have been passed. So they were really looking for people that could help them understand what are some of the biggest challenges that are facing each one of these agencies currently. So there were three types of people three groups that were part of the agency review teams. First, just volunteers like me, people who are volunteering for the transition in just their personal capacity. They're full-time transition employees. They're paid by the transition entity itself. So there's a legal entity and they actually are being paid by them. These are people like support staff for the transition that they need to actually physically run the operation. These are people that might end up working for the administration later after the transition, but these are people that are actually paid by the transition. And then there are detailees, people that are funded through an appropriation made by the General Services Administration. So these are those people like the agency leads and their team. There's certain people that are detailed just to the transition to help them make sure that it's smooth and it functions. They're all agency review teams are divided by agency or government department. You know, there's like education. I'm going to show you guys real quick what the agencies review teams, how they were divided. So it basically, you know, if you were one big, huge monster agency, like let's say education or state, probably it's your own review team. But you can see here that arts and humanities, they were in charge of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Science Foundation, I don't know why, and the Smithsonian. And you can, just by looking at this list, you can see like the kind of people that they had on the team. They really are experts in their field. There's a lot of academics, lots and lots of academics on the Biden-Harris transition agency review teams, but like the CFPB, you just see like the breadth and see how many people there actually are on these teams. I mean, we're talking hundreds of people were working for these agency review teams, and I'll get down to where where mine was. Mine's way at the bottom. Homeland Security, that's a big dog.
And these
Department of
people are
Justice.
hired / approved by the head of GSA or the head of the
No.
transitions.
These are people that the Biden-Harris administration had asked as subject matter experts on a particular agency
Oh, I got it.
to volunteer to be part of figuring out what is important to each individual agency and to go out to each one of the go out to constituencies and find out what people want to see the new administration do for work. So here's the thing that's interesting also is that all these people that are marked as volunteer, actually you have to take a leave of absence from your employer while you're doing this. You have to take vacation time. You can't be getting paid according to law to volunteer for the agency review teams, because the idea is they want you to be working full-time on the peaceful transition of power, working on these agencies, and they don't want you to have this strange perceived conflict of interest, I guess, which, I mean, okay, it's kind of silly, but it is for 2 months and you're working full-time on the transition. But yeah, they're trying to make it so that it doesn't seem like they are have a bad conflict of interest. So yeah, like I said, it depended on the size of the agency, how many agencies each review team was in charge of. What is the job specifically of the agency review team? So it's mostly to solicit ideas, as I said, from interested parties about what policies and programs people want for the new government. It's 100% less than who is actually going to work for each one of those agencies. I said before, there's 20, right now there was 20, well, at the beginning there was 22,000 open positions spread throughout all of these agencies. It isn't as if people aren't given on these agency review teams aren't given names of people that they would like to see as head of X agency. Those names are all passed on by the agency review teams, but it's not their job to actually find people to hire in each agency. Instead, it's really about what should the policies be of this incoming agency? What should the policies not be? What should we be getting rid of from the previous administration? These people who are named volunteers and named who the transition team asks to be on a specific team are really subject matter experts on that particular agency. They're leaders in their field and they're really sought after from the agency, from the transition, from the Biden-Harris team. At least I'll speak specifically to Biden-Harris. They're picked out the summer before the election. They start vetting people then. And by vetting, I mean, they are seriously vetting people. They're going through a real process of making sure that they have the very best people they can to be on these agency review teams. Most of the volunteers have no interest in actually working for the new administration. That's not entirely true. The agency review team that I worked on, the head of it was Gary Gensler, from MIT. He is now being named as the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He's going to be and that doesn't happen often, but it did happen in that case. But generally speaking, that's not how it works. The list of people on that team, as I said, are really heavily vetted. They only want people there. Well, at least Biden-Harris team only wanted people there who were actually there to do the work. In fact, most members of the teams have taken, like I said, a leave of absence from their current jobs. So how do we actually solicit questions from outside parties? How does that process work? I think that this is maybe the most interesting, because it's really, the question is really how is policy being created from these agency review teams to the outside interest groups, both private and public interest groups and other constituencies. So each, I remember this during the Obama administration too. Organizations put together a wish list. These are memorandums that are usually divided into 3 parts, like what you would like the administration to do within their first year or first 100 days, which people in Washington believe, that's your honeymoon period. You get 100 days to actually do the work that your most important work, the stuff that you promised to everybody. You can only really get that done in the first 100 days and they're sick of you. And then what you want them to do in the first year, and then what you want them to accomplish in their first term. So most people's issue papers are put out like that. I was in charge of writing ours for our union as it related to the banking and securities regulation. It's really about prioritization, because I think a lot of organizations like ours feel like you only get so many bites at the apple, to use a terrible cliche. You only are going to get so many asks of a new administration. So you really have to prioritize. Now you can imagine an organization like mine, the laborers union, while banking and securities regulation is important, perhaps something that is more important to our organization would be infrastructure, making sure our members are going to have work. That could be said for any organization. I'm thinking of like Public Citizen that we work with, for example. They're really focused on consumer rights. So to them, they're really interested in making sure that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is strengthened and can move forward and have real teeth to it. It's all about prioritization. And I think that's probably the most interesting thing. How do you figure out as an organization, and how is the new administration taking into consideration all of these priorities and making it into what their policy is going to be going forward? This is really complicated work, and it takes a lot of, and it was really even more complicated during this transition, because the Biden-Harris administration and all these people on these agency review teams were not allowed to talk to people in the agencies. They couldn't go in and talk to the people, the career civil servants that had been doing this work for 10, 20, 30 years of their lives. The people who are dedicated public servants who do the work of the Securities and Exchange Commission, who do the work of the EPA, State Department, et cetera. They were barred from talking to any of those people on the inside. And the Biden-Harris administration felt strongly that that's who they needed to talk. They really needed to talk to the people that were there. I know that seems simplistic, but you can see how that really harmed the ability for them to start planning and really get moving, at Jump Street right after the inauguration, because they were, I don't know if you guys remember, but they weren't allowed to go in and speak to anybody until January. They waited a very long time before the GSA signed off and was allowed to move in. So the challenge for the transition team is to make it an extremely open process. You want to be able to hear from every side, and you want to hear about what the fundamental disagreements are on a particular issue. I think that was a thing. I don't think this was unique to the Biden-Harris administration, but they really did want to hear, from Wall Street. They wanted to hear from labor unions like us who might have diametrically opposed opinions. They wanted to hear what each side was. What not allowing us to speak to people inside the agency, is not allowing the transitions teams in there, made it so they could only hear the outside noise. And I think that's dangerous and not good for government. It's not good for a functioning, preserved government. There was hardly any time to do the work, as I said, because the Trump team resisted, and that delayed all the work by several weeks. And what did it do in practice at the end of the day? At the end of the day, I think people on these transition teams took this work extremely seriously. These were people who really believed that that the people inside the government, the career civil servants, were really qualified to do that job, and not being able to talk to them really hindered the work. I should say what the actual work is. The end of the day, the work product that comes out of every agency review team is memos, hundreds and hundreds of memorandum that is given over to the Biden-Harris team that lays out everything that they heard from all the outside groups, prioritizing in their mind what things should be worked on in what order. Because of COVID, I talked to a friend of mine who was actually one of the named members on the team. He said that during normal years, what would happen is a lot of this stuff would happen over lunch, in person, over drinks. There'd be all-nighters and people would be working on it. None of that stuff could happen during COVID either. All of it was done virtually. I think people also think that was also a harm, not being able to meet face-to-face with people. It made it for a less smooth transition. So it's common, I think that.
Again,
yeah.
Can you, I mean, I have my own sense of that, but can you talk about how the sense you have of how lacking that face-to-face interaction harmed the process? Just in what ways? And we're guessing, but what's your guess?
So my guess is that when you're speaking on a virtual platform like this, you can't have as many one-on-one conversations with people. A lot of times the one, okay. So I'll tell you this like this. My particular area of interest is executive compensation, and how do we roll back, compensation to make sure that CEOs don't make as much money as they do, and it's really pay for performance. To sit around with a group of people who are also really interested in that topic and be able to banter back and forth and not worry about it being recorded, or not worry about, and I think that's a lot of it, is that not making sure that you can have these off the record conversations. It's harder to do that during a virtual world. That's my personal experience. And there is something to be said about having drinks with people, and going out and, being a little bit looser. And it was all very professional, for the transition team. All the interactions I had with them, was a lot like this, extremely professional. We're going to talk about this. We're going to go through an agenda. I don't think it happens that way necessarily when you don't have to 6 feet distance and wear a mask and worry about somebody killing you. Yeah. So all the memos come out. They hand them over to the Biden-Harris administration. They have one more meeting with all the team leads of all of the individual agency review teams, go over what they think prioritization should be. They still keep in touch with people from the transition teams over the memorandums that had come out, that they had put out. Most people have gone back to their day jobs. They don't work for the administration, as I said, but they're still seen as an active resource to the Biden-Harris team. So here is what I know. We don't have much time left, so I would just say this, that at the end of the day, it's the morale of, this is what we found, and what I found is the morale of career service workers in the federal government was at an all-time low. It was really hard for most career civil servants towards the end of the Trump administration. In fact, I looked up a survey from the OMB that said that it was the lowest it had been in 15 years from a survey that they did. Open positions weren't filled. The actual work of agencies wasn't being done. There was a distinct lack of regulations that were coming out. If you guys remember, Trump had announced that he wanted to axe 10 regulations for every new one that was written. So there was a lot of regulations not coming out. The work of the federal government wasn't happening in the same way. So it was our belief at the end of it, at least our union's belief, that the morale of all these civil servants had been so damaged under the Trump administration that the institution of government really had been harmed. It was left in real organizational chaos, and there was a mess left behind that the Trump or the Biden and Harris administration really have a hard job to fix. I think even comparing other transitions where there was a change in party, it might be fair to talk about like Bush. There was the Iraq War, there was Katrina. I mean, there was really hard things that the country was going through at the time. Whether or not that's comparable to a global pandemic, I don't know, but there still wasn't the same amount of distrust of government, and there wasn't the same amount of low morale for career civil servants. So how can they fix it? It's the problem now. I mean, I think there's a lot of room for debate about what they should do, but government is obviously gigantic. I said before, there's 2.1 million employees in the federal government, including the career civil servants and the people that are political appointees. One thing they can do it is they have to fund it properly. That's one thing that they can do to fix the government. You actually, if you remember, the federal government shut down for a pretty long time under the Trump administration. It has to be funded properly for people to actually make a government work. Trump also put a ban on hiring scientists, for example, at like the EPA over a certain level. You have to hire people and empower people who are the subject matter experts of a particular topic or who make it their lives work in order to want to work for the federal government. You have to make it worth it. And I think that the Biden-Harris administration is going to have a hard time, anybody would have a hard time fixing that. What you're trying to do is just make the government self-perpetuating and make it so the dynamics will make it function for a very long time to go. And you want to make sure that there's always a culture of truth, that there's an honesty to the work you do and you're empowering people to be able to make decisions. And that didn't happen over the last 4 years. So anyway, that's my basic experience with the transition and kind of what happened. Yes, Dr. Pierce.
I'm going to get you for that. None of my homebrewed beer for you.
I don't like beer. It's okay.
Oh,
I know.
Okay. I think the thing that you hit about the transition from Trump, the demoralization of the career civil servants, the gutting of agencies, we have been talking about that a lot. There's a more subtle thing I'm interested in hearing from you about, and that's that at lots of points in time, Biden has been comfortable portraying himself as a transitional figure.
Uh-huh.
He's kind of a placeholder. He kind of sees himself that way, and it's like, I'm going to pass this along, and that gets reflected in a lot of the comments about, well, he'll probably just do one term and then he's out of there. Part of that comes from his acute understanding that he's the old white guy, and that the coalition of the Democratic Party, we can go beyond that as well, because you had some really interesting things about the role of stakeholders in that process. But just intra-party, you've got folks who think Bernie was the best thing since sliced bread, who are fans of AOC and the squad. And then you have, more moderate folks. Did you see that kind of, how did you see that playing out? Did you see that come into play about the sort of struggle for how far things are going to get pushed?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I don't know if it's just because, our organization can feel the push and pull between the more centrist and the more liberal part of the party. But I think in the beginning, when our union put together our wish lists of what we wanted to see the new administration do, you shoot for the moon, right? You put in all kinds of things that you're not certain you're going to get. It's like when you're negotiating for salary, you give yourself another 25%, and you hope you meet the middle or whatever it is. Especially in the agencies where there has been some real sweeping changes made. You could definitely feel, I think how they fixed that is they made the Harris team a little bit more available to us in the transition. It felt more, I don't know why I feel this way, but it did feel as if they were planning for her team to be able to help push some of this agency work forward. So maybe that's the answer. Maybe that I think people believe that it makes sense that Vice President Harris is somebody who's going to be around in the party for a long time. I felt like they made her team more available.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think so. But I'm gonna volunteer to do this again. It really was interesting to see it from the inside. I had not gotten this close before. It is a lot of work. The people who are the named team members really eat and sleep this stuff all day long, and the breadth of experience from some of the people that we worked with just shamed me in my little world. I felt like how you feel like you're imposter syndrome, happens. I mean, a lot of them, MIT graduates and blah, 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 it was extremely intimidating, but it's a great thing to think about now. I think what it helped me to do is kind of the organizational theory of politics. I understand it a little bit more, how each part moves together, how the agencies, the importance of the agencies in the grand scheme of thing. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. I'm glad I got to do it.
Yay, I loved all of it. Okay, I have so many questions. The MOUs, my first two kind of just subject matter questions are the MOUs made public, or are they just internal documents? And then two, Pat brought up the stakeholders. Who determines which stakeholders are questioned and solicited for advice?
You're trying to make the net as big as possible. So, anybody who contacts the administration and writes a memo and says they want their voice to be heard is heard. There's nobody's turned away from any of the agency review teams. There's a premium for information from all of these review teams. That's the thing. That's the currency is information. So no, the memorandums aren't made public at all. They're actually the team members aren't allowed to share them with anybody else. They're kept secure. But yeah, who decides who? A lot of it's political too. Like, what's the most important thing? I guess for the Biden and Harris administration, there's a lot of constituencies that they're probably listening to over, say, I don't know, Goldman Sachs or something. I don't know, or an oil company. There's probably other constituencies they're listening to. That's who decides.
There's also the desire to not get surprised politically.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That you want to know the location of all the potential landmines. So it's that combination. I'm sorry, this is going to hark back to the old public policy class. This is what you do when you do partisan analysis, right? You want to have all the information expertise you possibly can, but you also want to see how various actors will use their expertise in particular partisan ways to either support or oppose options that you have in mind. And I am sure that the Biden-Harris team is not so politically naive that they're not thinking about that. It's got to be something they consider.
They were very open with their team's time, and open with wanting to consider every possible. I remember being on one of the first calls I was on was just for the labor movement. So there were about 100 people who were from a bunch of different unions who were concerned about securities regulation and banking regulation, and the absolute insanity of differing ideas from even that group is crazy train. There's a lot of opinions, even among a group that probably agrees on 85% of everything. I can only imagine how many opinions they solicited from other groups outside of ours. I know the time it took to put together our memo. I can only imagine how much reading all of them did, and how much research. I can't stress enough, though, that that time when they couldn't have interaction with the actual people who work at the agencies really did set them behind. And it forced them to, the bad thing about it is, who were they hearing from then? They were hearing from Wall Street during that time when they couldn't actually talk to people inside. They were having to hear from the outside. So that's a lot of noise that they could have been hearing from how it works in practicality. If we change the law to do X, what's going to happen with the regulations? If you guys put out notice and comment about this rule, how would that change your work working in the agency as a senior team member? They weren't able to do that. And I think that's dangerous. I don't think that's good for government, no matter what party you're on. And scene.
Someone asked, which I completely agree with, is she said, so I've got to say, I was just a lot shocked by all of this. Does every member of Congress know this information?
That there's agency review teams and how it all works?
Well,
Yeah.
just at how, like, it was my question. So just at like how much they were like blocked this time around.
Oh, how much
And
they
is this,
blocked.
yeah, like how there wasn't even really a transition team a year before election day, and 6 months in, you said they were supposed to be, meeting whatever weekly.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yes,
they know
they
all
knew.
of this, and hopefully, this isn't going to become precedent when my party is not your party, the next party that gets elected. I'm just going to stonewall everybody.
No, they absolutely knew, because the those two, the Senate and the House committees are hearing about it. They have to report back. The GSA is trying to report back. Yeah, I mean, they did know about it, and it is shocking. So it's obvious now how everything happened the way it did and how it all snowballed, and why that's super dangerous for the future. There has to be, I don't know. I don't know if I have some ideas about how you fix that, but it's a huge, complex problem, one that none of us ever thought about 4 years ago. We're all taught in grade school about the, peaceful transition of power. It's not, I don't think anybody thought it was gonna go down like that. Yeah, it's shocking.
But it's sort of the flip side of that had happened 4 years earlier. It's not as though Trump took it and his transition team took advantage of what Obama had to offer. I mean, I just took a look at, I'm going to read names from Trump's transition team in 2016, and you don't need to conceal your guffaws. Right?
My pillow guy.
Ben.
No, I'm sorry. Are you talking about?
That would have been awesome.
You're talking about the 2016 transition team. Is that pre or post election? Because there were two.
Well, this is the official transition team.
Okay, so probably post. Okay.
Ben Carson. Oh, come on, you got to laugh. Chris Christie, Michael, criminal Michael Flynn, Newt Gingrich, Rudy Giuliani, Jeff Sessions, Katie McFarland, Governor Mary Fallon, nobody's heard of, Senator Tim Scott, Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee, Kathy McMorris Rogers, Tom Reed, and Cynthia Lummis. You don't see in that team any respect for the substance of public policy. None. It was all about politics and campaigning. I'm going to beat my drum that I beat before. That really wasn't important. And for one thing, I would bet the farm that, the thing that Jennifer is quite rightly focusing on is access to agency expertise. I mean, again, if you sort of go back to the old public policy system and the way that no, go ahead and laugh. and the way that expertise and the kind of expertise that Jennifer was talking about was valued and played a central role in the making of public policy, and how that went away or was diminished with Ronald Reagan. Who knew it could get far worse? But it did. And so again, I would bet the farm that it's not as though they spent any time talking to career civil servants when Trump came in. They didn't bother. They knew what was right. They knew what they wanted to do ideologically, and they were, don't confuse them with the facts.
Yeah.
So one of the thoughts that I had was that, I mean, even in 2000, right, Bill Clinton preparing a transition team for somebody, right? And there was all this delay about who that person they were transitioning to. But there was a lot of conversations during all the recount stuff that both candidates had transition people in place,
Right.
and it started the transition process to ensure there was no disconnection. Either one could have a peaceful transfer of power. I remember James Baker making comments about that, right? Ben Ginsberg was making comments about Bush and Gore were still working to try and make sure, even though they were both believing that they won the election up until the Supreme Court did it, right? So I find that to be a fascinating comparison to where, 2020 went, because it's a totally different ball game.
Yeah,
Approaching that problem.
for sure.
Yeah. I mean, along with, it's not as though if you woke up Al Gore from in the middle of a nap or 2 o'clock in the morning and asked him, do you think you really won in 2000? He might say yes. And there was far more justification for him saying something like that than Donald Trump. But because he valued those norms in a way that Trump never will, he went ahead and conceded. So yeah, Adrienne, I think that's in so many ways, that's a great comparison case.
Yeah, I remember writing this same transition memo for the Clinton campaign. They had taken offices and were ready for the transition that August before the election. And that's when we started putting the memos together for that. Now that I think about it, yeah, strange days.
Leslie, did you want to jump in?
Well, it was just an observation about something that both Pat and Jen talked about, which is these norms. And it's something that I noticed in my work, that there can be laws that require certain things to happen. But if the parties do not, parties not as in political parties, but if the groups do not respect the rule of law, for example, there really aren't any enforcement mechanisms that anyone has ever had to enforce, and they seem to know it. And it's just fascinating that, Congress does spend all this time putting these protections in place, but when it comes to actually taking action, when someone doesn't follow through on the law, oftentimes it just doesn't actually happen. It's known that they're supposed to do it, and there's a lot of public scrutiny around that they haven't done it. But by the time they take action, or someone were to take action through the courts or something like that, we'll have already moved down the road and something else will have been decided. But it just occurred to me, this is just another example of that, is the disinterest in, kind of following the rule of law regarding transition was just one more example of that.
Do you mind if we take it off the recording for?
Yeah, I do. I have one question we'll put on the recording.
Okay.
So my consultant born this way hat, brain says to me that I want to know if in your experience, do you find, or would you have found it possible in the transition period to do an organizational audit or a department audit? Because to me, I think that transition always looks to what more we can do, what things do we want to change. And my consultant mind always wants to say, hold on, let's figure out the department as it exists and the policies that exist. Are they working? Like status quo check first before adding on top of it. In your experience, is that even possible given the parameters that you were able to work in? Is that even your job, or you're more looking to the future?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
it wasn't, it wouldn't have been possible. I mean, we weren't given access to, the team wasn't given access to anybody inside until far too late. So it would have been hard to do any of that. And like I said before, it was just my perspective that the incoming administration had to focus a lot on how are we going to fix things that had already been done versus what kind of sweeping changes can we make for the future. There was a lot of the immediate focus is how are we going to fix this, and that's not a good position for any party to be in for government, you know. And by fix this, I mean just really, as I said, there's all these unfilled positions. They weren't even able to do the work of government. Things weren't working the way that they were supposed to. The government shut down. You know, they weren't able to function. So I think it was even, I hope I'm stressing enough how poor the morale was of people that worked for those agencies. It is really a dire situation.
Yeah, and this is Anne. If I could just add one thing to that. I mean, even when the transition works, okay, it's still not a lot of time, okay?
That's true.
It's not ever possible. These are massive bureaucracies with, I don't know, thousands, tens of thousands of I mean, there is no way any transition team is ever going to come in and do an overall management review. It's just not possible. However, I think more effective transition teams, you can come in with very specific things that you want to know about each agency. And I think the more targeted you are with sort of your objectives of the transition, what are some of the high level things that need attending to, whether it's upcoming regulations or new reports that are going to come out, or major deadlines around reauthor, whatever those things are. I think you can be effective, but there's still limits to what any transition team can do. You have to be very targeted and focused in what you look at. So just a thought.
So Anne, so to follow up, so in your opinion, so transition work well if they're focused and they're always looking to future or objectives, something they'd like to do. And then on my end, relative to my concern about or a desire to do like a management audit, performance audit, something of that, organizational audit, that would be done by the head of the department and then done after officially confirmed? Or could that happen pre?
There's a couple ways to think about that. Number one, there are already sources of information that you can go to get that. So GAO does I forget what it's called, and maybe Leslie remembers, but it's sort of like the top vulnerabilities report for every cabinet agency, right? So material weaknesses, that's what they're called, right? So you've already got, like GAO, who identifies material weaknesses and problems. You've got OIG reports who do that. You've got summaries of material, and again, that's more of the audit term, the material weaknesses. But there are all kinds of sources of information you can go to sort of, or at least some sources to sort of understand, what's going on. But you can't do a performance audit. You can't do that kind of audit. And I mean, even CDC, it's
Right.
I don't know how many employees we have. We have like 12,000 employees or something. And I can't even, the number of programs we have, it's just, you're not going to do it. So you're going to pick and choose. You're going to pick and choose what's most important and where you think, and maybe it's the higher level policies is what you're looking at, as well as some of the,
That's it.
in terms of management, or workforce is a good one, that Jennifer mentioned is also critical, because you want to get your folks in there. And what you really what I found in the transition, and I wasn't I'm not at a level that I was really involved with at this time, but what they really want is visibility on what the heck is going on pretty quickly. So they want to establish communication channels. What are the reports that are coming out? What are the risk issues that have been identified within the agency so that there aren't surprises? So for example, all of our work that we're doing within CDC, and I think it was probably cross government around grants that we're going to issue, okay? They put a hold on all the grants that are going to be issued until it was like, they put it in place January 20th, only till February 10th, which is actually not very long. But essentially, all of our grants that were getting ready to be issued went to the department to be reviewed by the politicals, right? Which is very common. And it's not, because they don't want surprises, they want to know what's happening. So I think one of the most important things about transition is establishing the communication channels.
That makes sense.
So that you know what's happening. And then as you move into taking over, you kind of hit the ground running. So
That makes
And the
sense.
transition is about policy changes anyway. It's not about anything other. It's about, the overreaching policies and how they match the platform of the incoming administration. It's not about, can we get rid of the
Yeah.
Joe and his team at the whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
I mean, the management stuff can
so-
help you be effectively governed, but you're right, Jennifer, that's more the focus. Yeah.
Got it.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
and,
Pat.
and to go back to Michelle's question, what you hope to have on your transition team is a basic knowledge of the high level policy stuff, enough that they'll know sort of where the guardrails are. And
Yeah.
then, they won't consider something just
Yeah.
totally insane.
Yeah.
The rest of it's going to happen later. And Anne's absolutely right. You simply don't have time to do stuff on that more on the ground level. But it's really not the purpose of the transition team to get down into that nitty gritty. But you don't want to have policy proposals coming out of the transition team in those memoranda that are like totally unworkable. And you're hoping that you've assembled enough expertise on those groups so that doesn't happen. But both that they're not unworkable and they're not political landmines.
But when you're the agency for your topic area, we always know who's on the transition team for our topic area. And it's almost always a partner that we've worked with, or somebody from academic an institution, or from a nonprofit. Like, we always know who they are, and they're very familiar with our program. So, and then we can't talk to them for however many months, because they're on the transition.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
so we prep them before the transition. So that,
Yeah, that's
Which,
exactly what happens. Yep.
All right,
But-
I'm gonna
but if-
stop
But if
recording.
you're not talking to your partners all the time, you're not doing your job as a bureaucrat. Like, you gotta keep your partners close to get your work done. It's not possible otherwise.
All right, we're
Okay,
done
turn
now.
off the recording so I can curse.